You see, the Black Death didn't just kill people, it rewrote the rules of being human. Understanding it reveals something profound about how quickly everything you know can vanish, and how the living rebuild from ashes. Tonight, as the rain taps against your window like fingertips on glass, I want to share something that will change how you think about survival. Welcome, I'm the historian. I have walked through the dust of ages, and today, I will tell you what I saw when the Great Dying came to Europe. When the air itself seemed poisoned, and every sunrise brought news of villagers that would never wake again. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to see how quickly civilization can crumble and how the survivors built something entirely new from the ruins. Let us know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you safe in your warm bed? Good. Hold on to that feeling. Now, take a moment to dim the lights. Close your eyes if you wish. I want you to imagine Europe in 1347, not the Europe of your history books, but the Europe I walked through, where every breath carried the weight of uncertainty, and every goodbye might be forever. The plague wasn't just a disease. It was a teacher, a brutal, unforgiving teacher that showed Europe exactly what it was made of. Tonight, I'll tell you what those lessons cost and what they built. I remember standing on the docks of Caffa in 1346, watching the Genoese merchant ships prepare for their journey home. The harbor smelled of tar and rotting fish, mixed with something else I couldn't place then, something sweet and wrong that seemed to cling to the wooden hulls like a curse. The siege was ending. The Mongol army had been camping outside the city walls for months, their own ranks thinning from some mysterious sickness that left men gasping and black-spotted before death claimed them. In desperation, their commanders had begun hurling the corpses of their fallen over the city walls with massive catapults. Can you imagine? Using death itself as a weapon, but the Mongols didn't know what they were truly unleashing. Neither did the merchants loading their ships with silk, spices, and grain. They thought they were escaping death. Instead, they were carrying it to every port in the Mediterranean. I followed one ship, the Santa Maria del Grazie. Its captain, Marco Venier, was a practical man who believed in profit above superstition. When 3 of his crew fell ill during the voyage, he assumed it was the usual sailor's disease: too much wine, bad food, the strain of long days at sea. The first man died 2 days out from Caffa. By morning, his body was covered in dark swellings the size of apples, and his fingers had turned black as if burned by invisible fire. Venier ordered the body thrown overboard without ceremony. "God's will," he muttered, making the sign of the cross. But this wasn't God's will. This was Yersinia pestis, though they wouldn't know its name for centuries. A bacterium so perfectly designed for killing that it seemed crafted by some malevolent genius. It lived in the fleas that infested the ship's rats, multiplying in their bellies until the fleas themselves died and went searching for new hosts. Warm human blood. Your blood. My blood. The second sailor died the next day. Then the third. Then Venier's nephew, a boy of 16 who joined the voyage to learn the merchant trade. I watched the captain's faith crack like old leather as he threw his sister's son into the wine-dark sea. By the time the ship reached Constantinople, half the crew was dead. The survivors were hollow-eyed and desperate, their clothes reeking of death and fear. But they still had cargo to sell, coins to earn, families to feed. So they docked. They unloaded. They traded, and the dying began. Constantinople had survived Arab armies, crusader sacks, and centuries of siege. But this enemy slipped through the city's walls like smoke through cracks. I walked the streets of the great city and watched it transform day by day. The magnificent Hagia Sophia, where emperors had once been crowned, became a hospital, then a morgue, then simply a place where people came to die with some dignity. The smell hit you first, not just death, but the particular sweetness of bubonic plague. Once you knew it, you could never forget it. It was the smell of hope rotting. I saw A mother carried her dead child through the streets for 3 days because she couldn't accept that no priest was available for burial. Every church was full of corpses waiting for last rites that would never come. I saw merchants selling their entire fortunes for passage on any ship heading west, away from the dying city. But west was exactly where the plague wanted to go from. Constantinople, it spread like spilled wine across cloth. Every port, every trade route, every road that had once brought prosperity now became a highway for death. I followed it to Genoa, where the docks fell silent except for the sound of waves against empty ships. To Venice, where the canals began, to smell of more than salt water and sewage. And then to Marseille. Marseille in 1347 was the gateway to France, a bustling port where ships from across the Mediterranean brought goods, ideas, and dreams. I arrived there on a cold November morning when the Mistral wind was howling off the water like a living thing. The Genoese merchants had beaten me there. Their ships sat in the harbor like floating tombs, most of their crews dead or dying. But the city's officials were in a bind. These ships carried valuable cargo, silk that Parisian nobles were waiting for, spices that would bring fortunes in the northern markets. So they made a choice that would damn half of Europe. They allowed the unloading to continue. I watched. The dock workers, good honest men with calloused hands and strong backs, hauling bales of silk and sacks of grain. They joked and laughed, planning how they'd spend their wages. Some talked about their children, others about their wives waiting at home with hot soup and warm beds. Within a week, most of them were dead. The plague moved through Marseille like water through a broken dam. I saw families barricade themselves in their homes, pushing furniture against doors and windows, as if they could keep death out with chairs and tables. Children stopped playing in the streets. The city's famous fish market, usually loud with haggling and laughter, went silent except for the buzz of flies around abandoned stalls. But the most heartbreaking thing I witnessed was how quickly love became fear. Husbands abandoned wives. Parents left children, not because they stopped caring, but because caring itself became a form of suicide. To touch the sick meant joining them. To comfort meant certain death. I remember one family, the Dubois. The father, Henri, was a baker who made the best bread in the quarter. His wife, Marie, could make you laugh even when your purse was empty. Their daughter, little Sophie, was 7 years old with eyes like summer sky. Henri fell sick first. Those terrible swellings appeared in his neck and armpits, hard as stones and black as night. Marie nursed him anyway, bringing water and cool cloths, whispering prayers and promises. Sophie brought him drawings, crude stick figures of their family under a bright yellow sun. Henri died on a Tuesday. Marie followed on Thursday. Sophie lasted until Saturday. I buried them myself in a small plot behind their bakery because there was no one else left to do it. The priest had fled. Weeks earlier, the gravediggers were all dead. The city had begun burning bodies in massive pyres that painted the sky orange and filled the air with smoke that tasted of endings. From Marseille, the plague spread inland like cracks in breaking glass. I followed it north through France, watching it devour cities and countryside with equal hunger. Avignon, where the Pope himself prayed for deliverance while his cardinals died around him. Paris, where the Seine carried so many bodies that the king banned fishing for months. But it wasn't just the death that changed everything. It was how the death revealed what people truly believed, what they truly valued, when everything else was stripped away. I saw merchants sell holy relics for the price of bread. I saw nobles work in their own fields because all their serfs were dead. I saw children ruling households because they were the only ones left alive. The careful hierarchies that had governed European life for centuries collapsed in months. Some people turned to God with desperate fervor. Others decided God had abandoned them entirely. I watched processions of flagellants, men and women who whipped themselves bloody in the streets, believing their pain could somehow balance the scales of divine justice. their blood mixed with the rain on cobblestones, and still the dying continued. Others turned to stranger explanations. The Jews were blamed, of course. Entire communities were burned alive by mobs convinced that poison wells had caused the plague. I tried to stop some of these massacres, but what can one voice do against the roar of terrified thousands? The irony was crushing. These communities they destroyed were dying of plague at the same rate as everyone else. The disease didn't care about religion, race, or wealth. It was perfectly democratic in its cruelty, but the most profound change was something quieter, something that would reshape Europe forever. The plague began to kill the very idea of unchanging social order. When lords died faster than peasants, when merchants perished while beggars survived, when entire noble bloodlines vanished in weeks, well, people started to question why they'd ever believed some humans were born to rule while others were born to serve. I remember walking through a village in Normandy where everyone was dead except for one family, former serfs who'd inherited their lord's manor simply by outliving him. The father, Jean, stood in the great hall wearing his master's clothes and staring at the portraits on the walls. "Am I the lord now?" he asked me. "Is this how it works?" I couldn't answer him, but the plague could. The answer was yes, if you were alive, if you were willing, if you were strong enough to claim it, then yes. You were whatever you chose to become. The ships that had carried death were now empty, rotting in harbors across the Mediterranean. But they delivered more than plague. They delivered revolution, not the kind that comes with armies and banners, but the quiet kind that rewrites the rules of what it means to be human. As winter settled over Europe in 1347, the Great Dying was just beginning. But already, in the ashes of the old world, I could see the seeds of something new. Something that would be both terrible and wonderful in ways no one could imagine. The Black Death wasn't just ending lives. It was ending an entire way of life that had stood for 1,000 years. And in the silence left behind, I could hear the footsteps of a different world approaching. By the spring of 1348, I had learned to recognize the sound a city makes when it's dying. Not the dramatic crash of walls falling or armies clashing. Nothing so clean as that. No, a plague city dies with whispers and wet coughs, with the creak of shutters that will never open again, with the echo of footsteps in streets that grow emptier each day. I was in Florence when the dying truly began in earnest. The city had always been proud of its sophistication, its art, its banking, its magnificent cathedral rising like a prayer-made stone. The Florentines believed their civilization made them somehow above the crude diseases that plagued lesser cities. They were wrong. The plague arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because the market bells were ringing, calling people to buy bread that many would never live to finish. By Thursday, those same bells were tolling for the dead. By the end of the month, there was no one left to ring them. Giovanni Boccaccio was there too, watching his city consume itself. He would later write about bodies piled like cordwood, about dogs that refused to approach the dead, about the way normal human decency simply stopped. But even his words, powerful as they were, couldn't capture the particular texture of those days. The smell, for instance. Every city has its own scent. Venice smells of salt and prosperity, Paris of bread and ambition, London of coal and rain. But plague cities all smell the same. Sweet rot mixed with burning wood and desperate prayers. The smoke from funeral pyres that never stopped burning, day or night, until the very air seemed thick with ash and sorrow. I watched families make impossible choices. Do you nurse your sick child and likely die yourself? Or do you flee and live with the knowledge that you abandoned them? There were no good answers, only different kinds of guilt. The Medici family, yes, those Medicis, lost 17 members in 2 months. I saw old Everardo de' Medici, the family patriarch, standing in his counting house, surrounded by ledgers that would never be balanced, gold that would never be counted. His hands shook not from age, but from the weight of watching his legacy die one funeral at a time. What good is wealth, he asked me, when there's no one left to inherit it? The poor died differently than the rich, but they still died. In the narrow alleys where families crowded 10 to a room, the plague moved like fire through dry grass. But wealth bought you privacy to die, not immunity from dying. I saw noble houses where entire bloodlines ended in empty rooms filled with expensive silence. The priests died too. This was perhaps the cruelest twist of all. The very people charged with explaining God's will, with providing comfort and last rites, were dying faster than anyone else. They couldn't refuse the sick. Their calling demanded they go where death was thickest. I knew Father Antonio at the Church of Santa Maria Novella, a gentle man who'd spent 30 years tending his flock, baptizing babies, marrying young couples, burying grandparents who'd lived full lives. He'd never imagined he'd spend his final weeks giving last rites to children, to healthy adults who fell sick between sunrise and sunset. He lasted longer than most, 6 weeks of constant service before the plague claimed him too. I found him in his church, collapsed at the altar, still clutching the holy oil he'd been using for final sacraments. Even in death, his face held a kind of peace. He died doing what he believed God called him to do, but his death created a crisis that spread beyond Florence. When priests die faster than they can be replaced, who performs the sacraments? Who marries the living? Who buries the dead? The church's careful hierarchy crumbled under the weight of simple mathematics. Too many corpses, not enough holy men. This is when I began to notice something that would reshape Christianity forever. Ordinary people started performing rites they'd been taught only priests could do. Mothers baptized their own dying children. Husbands gave last rites to their wives using whatever words they could remember, not because they stopped believing, but because God felt very far away and death felt very close. The church would later try to claw back this power, but it was too late. Something fundamental had shifted. When survival requires breaking sacred rules, people learn that rules are more fragile than they'd imagined. From Florence, I traveled north toward Milan. The roads between cities had become something from a fever dream. Abandoned carts full of goods no one would ever claim. Wild dogs that had learned to avoid human settlements entirely. Villages where the only sound was wind through empty doorways. I stopped at an inn that should have been bustling, with merchants and pilgrims. Instead, I found it run by a 12-year-old girl named Katerina. Her parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles were all dead. She was keeping the inn open because she didn't know what else to do, serving stale bread and watered wine to the few. Travelers desperate enough to risk the roads. "Are you afraid?" I asked her. She considered this seriously, as children do. "I was afraid," she said finally, "but fear gets tiring. Now I'm just doing the next thing, doing the next thing." In those 4 words, she captured something I'd seen across the dying continent. When horror becomes ordinary, when death becomes routine, people don't become heroes or monsters. They just do the next thing. Feed the chickens, bury the bodies, sweep the floor, keep breathing. Milan itself was a revelation. The city had implemented something unprecedented, a quarantine system. Ships had to wait 40 days before unloading. Sick people were isolated in special hospitals. Guards prevented anyone from entering or leaving infected areas. The Milanese had learned something that would save thousands of lives. Sometimes the only way to show love is through distance. I watched families say goodbye through shuttered windows. Children who would grow up as orphans waving to parents they'd never see again. It was heartbreaking and brilliant and completely necessary. Milan's death rate was half that of cities that kept their doors open. But even in Milan, the plague found ways to seep through the cracks. I saw it spread through the very people trying to contain it. The doctors, the priests, the guards. Heroes and martyrs who died protecting others from the very death they carried. Dr. Galeazzo de Santa Sofia was Milan's chief physician. He'd studied at the University of Paris, learned everything medical science could teach him. Yet he was fighting an enemy that made his knowledge useless. Bloodletting made patients weaker. Prayers offered no protection. Even his careful observations and notes seemed pointless when 90% of his patients died regardless of treatment. But he kept working, day after day, house after house, body after body. Not because he believed he could win, but because someone had to try. I found him one evening, slumped over his desk, scribbling notes about symptoms and patterns with hands that shook from exhaustion. "I think," he told me, "that this disease comes from corrupted air, from the alignment of planets, from the sins of our generation. But honestly, historian, I no longer care why it kills. I just want to know how to stop it." He never found out. The plague took him 2 days later, along with his carefully recorded observations that might have saved lives in future outbreaks. Knowledge dying with the knowledgeable, another form of destruction the plague specialized in. From Milan, I followed the trade routes north. The plague moved like water finding its level, following rivers and roads, markets and monasteries. It had its own geography now, its own twisted logic. Big cities fell fast and hard. Small villages sometimes escaped entirely or died so completely that grass grew in their streets. I reached Paris in the autumn of 1348. The great city was fighting the plague the only way it knew how, with ceremony and protocol. King Philip VI had ordered special masses, public prayers, processions carrying holy relics through streets thick with infection. The nobility retreated to their country estates, believing fresh air and distance would protect them. They were half right. Distance helped. But the plague had already seated itself in the countryside too. I watched one such procession. Hundreds of people crowding together, breathing the same air, touching the same sacred objects, praying with voices that sent droplets of saliva into the morning light. It was magnificent and heartbreaking and absolutely catastrophic from the perspective of disease transmission. Within 2 weeks, a third of the participants were dead. But here's what struck me most about Paris. Even as people died, life continued. With stubborn persistence, bakers still baked bread, though for fewer customers each day. Street musicians still played songs, though their audiences grew thinner. Children still played games in the shadows of funeral pyres. I saw a young couple get married in a ceremony attended only by a handful of survivors and the bride's dying father. They exchanged rings while church bells tolled for the dead, kissed while smoke from cremation fires drifted through the cathedral windows. It should have been grim. Instead, it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. Love, it turned out, was stronger than fear. Not always, not for everyone, but often enough to matter. Often enough to keep the world turning even when half of it was dying. The University of Paris, that great center of learning, became a laboratory for understanding catastrophe. Master physicians and theologians worked frantically to explain what was happening. They blamed everything: corrupted air, angry stars, divine punishment, Jewish conspiracies, the sins of their generation. They were grasping for meaning in chaos, for patterns in randomness. It's what humans do when faced with the incomprehensible. We create stories to make sense of senselessness, even when those stories are wrong. But their wrongness didn't matter as much as their trying. Every failed theory, every useless treatment, every desperate prayer was a small act of rebellion against despair. People refused to simply lie down and die. They fought, even when fighting was futile. Dr. Bernard de Gordon, one of the university's most respected physicians, developed an elaborate theory about planetary alignments causing the plague. Completely wrong, of course, but his writings included careful observations about how the disease spread, what symptoms appeared when, and which treatments seemed to help even slightly. He died before finishing his treatise, but his notes survived. Other physicians read them, learned from them, built upon them. Knowledge accumulated even as its creators perished. This is how human civilization survives catastrophe, not through the persistence of any individual life, but through the stubborn continuity of ideas passing from dying hands to living ones. Winter came early that year, or perhaps it just felt that way. Paris under snow looked like a beautiful corpse, still magnificent, but empty of the life that had given it meaning. The Seine froze early, trapping ships in ice and forcing the plague to spread by land instead of water. This actually slowed its progress. Cold weather killed the fleas that carried the disease. Some villages that might have died in spring survived simply because winter arrived first. Random salvation. The plague taught me that survival often comes down to nothing more meaningful than luck and timing. But spring would come again. And when it did, the dying would resume. By then, though, something else was happening alongside the death. The survivors were learning, not just about quarantine and medicine, but about themselves. When everything familiar disappears, when all the old certainties crumble, people discover what they're truly made of. Some discover courage they never knew they possessed. Others find darkness they wish they could forget. Most find both. The Black Death was teaching Europe a lesson it would never forget. That civilization is far more fragile than anyone wants to believe, but also far more resilient. It can die in months, but it can also rebuild in ways that are stronger, stranger, and more beautiful than what came before. As winter deepened and the death rate slowed, I left Paris behind. The worst was yet to come. The plague was still spreading, east and north, still learning, still killing. But already, in the ruins of the old world, I could see the first green shoots of something new. The great dying had only just begun. I arrived in London in the spring of 1349, when the Thames ran brown with unseasonable rain and the city felt like a held breath. The English had been watching the plague devour continental Europe for months, praying that the Channel would protect them as it had from so many invasions. But the sea that had once been England's shield became its gateway to hell. The first infected ship docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset on a gray June morning. I was there, standing on the harbor wall, watching the sailors struggle to tie their lines with hands that shook from more than fatigue. Half their crew was already dead. The rest wouldn't live to see midsummer, but they had to dock. They had cargo to deliver, debts to pay, families waiting. So they unloaded their goods into English hands, and England's protection ended with a handshake between a dying Italian merchant and a perfectly healthy English dock worker. The worker's name was Thomas Baker. He had 5 children and a wife, who made the best meat pies in Dorset. Within a month, the entire Baker family was dead, along with most of their village, along with most of Dorset. The plague moved through England like it owned the place. London tried everything Paris had tried, and failed just as completely. King Edward III ordered special prayers, public processions, charitable donations to appease divine wrath. The Archbishop of Canterbury declared special fasting days, as if hunger could somehow balance the cosmic scales. None of it mattered. The plague had its own agenda. I walked through Cheapside in August 1349, and it was like touring a museum of stop time. Shops stood open with goods still on the shelves, but no merchants to sell them. Money lay scattered in the streets because there was nothing left to buy. The great market that had fed half of London was attended only by ravens and wild dogs. The Tower of London, that symbol of royal power, became a massive morgue. The crown jewels sat unguarded because the guards were all dead. King Edward's court scattered to country estates, then watched the plague follow them there too. Nowhere was safe. Nowhere was far enough. But it was the church's crisis that truly shattered the medieval world. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had explained suffering as God's will, promised that faith would be rewarded, taught that proper observance guaranteed salvation. Then the plague arrived, and the most devout died just as fast as sinners. Priests perished giving last rites. Nuns died caring for orphans. Entire monasteries fell silent not from contemplation but from death. I visited the Abbey of St. Albans in October 1349. It had been one of England's most powerful religious houses, home to monks who'd spent their lives copying sacred texts and illuminating manuscripts. I found the scriptorium empty except for one monk, Brother William, sitting at his desk with a half-finished page before him. His hands were stained black with ink and early signs of plague. He was dying, but he kept working, copying out passages from the Bible with careful, beautiful script. When he saw me watching, he set down his quill. "I thought," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "that if I finished this page, God might. But that's not how it works, is it?" He died that night. I completed the page for him. Not well. My script was clumsy compared to his trained hand, but I finished it. Someone should finish things when they can be finished. The abbey fell completely silent within a week. 27 monks dead, their centuries of accumulated wisdom dying with them. But worse than the loss of knowledge was the loss of meaning. These men had devoted their lives to understanding God's will. What did it mean when God's will appeared to be their destruction? This crisis of faith spread as widely as the plague itself. I saw it in every church, every cathedral, every humble parish. People still prayed, but their prayers changed. Instead of asking for blessings, they begged for explanations. Instead of praising God's mercy, they questioned his silence. Father Michael at St. Paul's Cathedral in London put it most starkly. I found him one evening, standing alone in the vast nave, staring up at the vaulted ceiling as if he could see through it to heaven itself. "Where is he?" Father Michael asked. Not to me, but to the empty air. Where is God when children die screaming? Where is mercy when good people suffer and evil people escape? Where is justice when entire families are erased from existence? I had no answer. I've walked through enough centuries to know that suffering rarely comes with explanations attached, but the people demanded explanations anyway. And when the church couldn't provide them, they began creating their own. The flagellant movement spread across Europe like a counterplague of desperate devotion. I followed one group from village to village, watching hundreds of people whip themselves bloody in public squares, convinced that their pain could somehow pay the debt their generation owed to God. They moved in processions that looked like rivers of agony. Men and women, rich and poor, noble and peasant, all united in the belief that they could beat the plague out of their bodies, their communities, their world. Their backs were raw meat, their faces ecstatic with suffering. In Strasbourg, I watched them whip themselves for 3 days straight, while the plague continued killing people around them at the same rate as before. Their blood mixed with spring rain on cobblestones, but the dying didn't slow. If anything, their gatherings just spread the infection faster. Yet I understood their desperation. When the world stops making sense, when every prayer goes unanswered, when good people die while evil ones prosper, sometimes pain is the only honest response. Better to feel something, even agony, than to feel nothing at all. Other people chose different forms of madness. The dance of death swept through German cities like a fever. Entire crowds would begin dancing in the streets, not celebration, but compulsion. Wild, frenzied movement that continued for hours, sometimes days, until dancers collapsed from exhaustion or died from their exertion. I saw one such dance in Cologne. It started with a young woman who'd just buried her family. She began swaying in the cathedral square, moving to music only she could hear. Others joined her, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They danced until their feet bled, until their hearts gave out, until death took them mid-step. But here's the strange thing. Many of them smiled while they danced, as if they'd found, in that moment of shared madness, something that made sense when nothing else did. The Jews suffered doubly. First from the plague like everyone else, then from the rage of survivors looking for someone to blame. I witnessed the massacre at Strasbourg, where 2,000 people were burned alive in their own cemetery while crowds cheered. The irony was bitter. These communities they destroyed were dying of plague at exactly the same rate as their Christian neighbors. The lies people told themselves to make sense of the senseless were almost as destructive as the disease itself. Poisoned wells, occult conspiracies, divine punishment for tolerance. Anything that offered someone to blame, some reason for the unreasonable. I try to stop some of these killings, but what can one voice do against the roar of 1,000? People convinced they've found the source of their suffering? Fear makes people stupid, and desperate fear makes them monstrous. Meanwhile, the plague continued its education in Europe. It was teaching lessons no one wanted to learn about the difference between how the world should work and how it actually works. About the gap between what people claim to believe and what they do when their backs are against the wall. The feudal system, that careful pyramid of lords and serfs, nobles and peasants, began cracking under pressure it was never designed to bear. When entire bloodlines died out in weeks, when labor became more valuable than land because there were so few laborers left alive, when peasants could simply walk away from one lord and work for another who offered better terms. Well, the whole structure started to look less like divine order and more like a complicated game that only worked as long as everyone agreed to keep playing. I met Sir Geoffrey de Montfort in what had once been his thriving manor in the Cotswolds. He was sitting alone in his great hall, staring at the high table where his family had eaten for generations. His wife was dead. His sons were dead. His serfs were dead. His lands, the source of his wealth and power, were returning to wilderness because there was no one left to farm them. "I am lord of nothing," he told me. "I command no one. I rule over rabbits and weeds." But here's what fascinated me about Sir Geoffrey. He didn't die of despair. Instead, he picked up a plow, something no nobleman had touched in centuries, and began working his own fields. When other survivors found him, they didn't see a lord anymore. They saw a man with strong hands and useful skills. He lived another 30 years, not as a nobility, but as a farmer. And he was, by all accounts, happier as a farmer than he'd ever been as a lord. The plague was performing surgery on European society, cutting away parts that no longer served any purpose, and leaving behind only what was essential for survival. It was brutal surgery, performed without anesthetic, but what emerged was something new. New forms of Christianity that were more personal, less hierarchical. New economic relationships based on labor rather than birthright. New ideas about individual worth that had nothing to do with the family you were born into. Most importantly, new stories about what it meant to be human. Stories written in mass graves and empty churches, in abandoned castles and thriving peasant communes. Stories that said, "You are not what your parents were. You are not what society tells you to be. You are what you choose to become in the face of impossible odds." The Great Dying was teaching Europe that everything they believed about permanence was an illusion. Kings died like beggars. Nobles rotted like peasants. Cathedrals stood empty, while humble cottages sheltered the last sparks of human warmth. But it was also teaching them something else, that from complete destruction, something entirely new could grow. Not better, necessarily, but different. More honest about human fragility, more appreciative of human resilience. As autumn turned to winter in 1349, the plague's initial fury was beginning to ebb in some regions. Not because it was defeated. You don't defeat something like this, but because it had killed everyone it was going to kill in those places. The survivors were often those with some natural resistance, or simply those who'd been lucky enough to avoid exposure. These survivors looked around at the world the plague had left them and faced a choice: rebuild the old world as closely as possible, or create something entirely new. Most chose somewhere between the two, keeping what worked, discarding what didn't, inventing solutions to problems that had never existed before. The Great Dying was ending, but the Great Change had only just begun. By 1351, I was walking through a Europe that felt like a house after a fire, recognizable in outline, but fundamentally different in every detail that mattered. The plague had burned through the continent for 4 years, and what remained was something no one had planned or expected. Empty was the first thing you noticed. Villages with more graves than houses. Cities where entire districts stood abandoned, their windows staring blindly at streets that remembered laughter. But emptiness, I learned, has its own strange beauty. Nature was already beginning to reclaim what humans had briefly claimed from it. I watched wolves return to regions where they hadn't been seen for centuries. Forests sprouted in former farmlands. Rivers that had been channeled and controlled for agriculture began to meander freely. Again, the plague had given Europe an unintended gift, a chance to rest, to breathe, to remember what it looked like before humans bent it entirely to their will. But the survivors weren't resting. They were busy building something unprecedented. A world where scarcity had been replaced by abundance, where labor was more valuable than land, where a peasant could look a lord in the eye and negotiate terms. The economics were simple and revolutionary. When half your population dies, the survivors inherit everything. Not just property and wealth, but opportunity and choice. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had leverage. I met John Miller in a village outside Oxford where he'd been born a serf, bound to his lord's land with no hope of escape. Before the plague, John worked dawn to dusk for barely enough grain to keep his family alive. His children would have lived and died as serfs, and their children after them, forever. But John's lord was dead. So was the lord's heir, and his heir's heir. The manor house sat empty except for ravens and memories. John had moved into it not from ambition, but from practicality. It was the only building large enough for all the orphaned children he'd taken in. "Am I stealing?" he asked me, gesturing at the fine furniture around us. "From who?" I replied, "The dead don't own property." This conversation was happening across Europe. Survivors staring at empty castles, abandoned workshops, fertile fields with no owners. The careful legal structures that had governed property for centuries simply evaporated when everyone who understood them died. The result was the largest redistribution of wealth in European history, not through revolution or reform, but through the simple arithmetic of mass death. Peasants became landowners. Apprentices inherited entire guilds. Servants found themselves masters of houses they'd once cleaned. But here's what made it truly revolutionary. Many of them were better at it than the people they'd replaced. Take Master Edmund, a blacksmith in Canterbury who'd inherited his shop when his master died childless. Before the plague, Edmund had been forbidden from making anything more complex than horseshoe nails. Guild rules protected the master's monopoly on sophisticated work. After the plague, with half the blacksmiths dead and desperate demand for everything from plowshares to door hinges, Edmund began making things he'd only watched others create. Turns out, he had a gift for it. His tools were better designed, more durable, more elegant than what the guild masters had produced. When the guild tried to reassert control, Edmund simply laughed. "You want to find me?" he asked. "I'll take my hammer and find work somewhere else." Every village in England needs a blacksmith more than they need your rules. The guild backed down. They had to. In a world where skilled workers were precious and irreplaceable, the workers held power they'd never possessed before. This shift rippled through every aspect of society. I watched it transform everything from marriage to warfare to art. Marriage became more about choice and less about property transfer. When parents and matchmakers were dead, young people started picking their own partners based on strange new criteria like affection and compatibility. Revolutionary concepts. I attended a wedding in Yorkshire where the bride was a former kitchen maid who'd inherited a wealthy household, marrying a former stable boy who'd become the region's most successful horse trader. Their parents would have been horrified by such a mismatch. But their parents were dead, and they were alive and in love and wealthy enough to live exactly as they pleased. The ceremony was performed by a blacksmith who'd learned to read Latin during the long winter, nights when there was nothing else to do. The church still hadn't replaced all its dead priests, so communities were making do with whoever could perform the necessary rituals. Sacred and secular authority were blending in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Warfare changed too, though not immediately in ways anyone expected. With so many knights dead and noble bloodlines extinct, traditional armies couldn't be assembled. But this created opportunities for a different kind of soldier, professionals who fought for payment rather than feudal obligation. I followed one such company, led by a former peasant named Black, who'd taught himself swordplay by practicing with the weapons of dead nobles. His men were survivors, cunning, adaptable, absolutely ruthless when necessary. They weren't fighting for God or king or honor. They were fighting for money and survival, which made them incredibly effective. Blackwell's company was hired by 3 different lords that summer, sometimes fighting for one against another in the same campaign. Loyalty was negotiable when everyone who'd traditionally commanded it was dead. The plague had taught these men that all authority is temporary, all allegiances conditional. But the most profound changes were happening in the minds of ordinary people. The plague had shattered the medieval worldview so completely that survivors were forced to build new ways of understanding reality from the ground up. I spent time with Sister Margaret, one of the few nuns who survived the plague in her convent. Near Bath, she'd watched 23 of her sisters die, had given last rites when no priest was available, had buried women she'd prayed with for decades. I thought faith protected us, she told me. I thought virtue mattered to God. I thought. She never finished that sentence, but I knew what she meant. She'd thought the world made sense. That good behavior led to good outcomes. That prayer was answered proportionally to its sincerity. The plague had taught her that reality was far stranger and more random than that. But instead of losing her faith entirely, she developed something more complex, a belief in a God who was present but not controlling, loving but not protecting, real but not necessarily fair. This new spirituality was emerging everywhere. More personal, more questioning, less certain about cosmic justice, but more committed to human compassion. People who'd seen how quickly divine protection could evaporate were more focused on protecting each other. The art that emerged from this period reflected this shift. Paintings became more realistic, more focused on human emotion and suffering. The stylized saints of pre-plague art gave way to portraits of real people dealing with real pain. Beauty became less about perfection and more about truth. I watched a young artist named Thomas painting an altarpiece in a church in Norwich. Instead of depicting saints with golden halos and serene expressions, he painted ordinary people with plague scars and tired eyes, but also with a kind of fierce dignity that spoke to what they'd survived. The church wants saints, he told me, but I paint humans. Saints don't get sick. Saints don't doubt. Saints don't choose between saving their children or saving their souls. But humans do all of that and keep going anyway. That's the real miracle. The economy was rebuilding too, but along completely different lines. With labor scarce and valuable, workers could demand wages that would have been unthinkable before the plague. A skilled carpenter could earn in a day what had previously taken a week. Farmers could lease land on terms that actually allowed them to profit from their work. I met a woman named Alice Cooper, no relation to the singer, obviously, who'd parlayed her survival into something approaching prosperity. Before the plague, she'd been a laundress, washing clothes for pennies. Afterward, with most of the competition dead, she'd expanded into running an entire cleaning service for the wealthy survivors who were too proud to do their own washing, but too reduced in circumstances to maintain household staff. Alice now employed 12 people and was negotiating to buy the house she'd once worked in as a servant. She wore fine clothes and spoke to former nobles as an equal because, practically speaking, that's what she'd become. The plague taught me. she said, that being lowborn just meant you started low. It didn't mean you had to stay there. This wasn't just individual success, it was systemic transformation. The rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe were melting like ice in spring, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more fluid, more negotiable, more based on achievement than inheritance. The survivors were also learning about medicine and public health in ways that would reshape European civilization. Not formal medical knowledge. Most university-trained physicians had died, but practical understanding of how disease spread and how to prevent it. Dr. Sarah de Montpellier had been a midwife before the plague. Midwives weren't considered real doctors, but they'd always known things about cleanliness and infection that university physicians dismissed as superstition. When the formal medical establishment died, Sarah's knowledge suddenly became valuable. She'd noticed that washing hands between patients reduced infection rates. She'd observed that isolation slowed disease spread. She discovered that certain herbs could ease symptoms even if they couldn't cure the underlying condition. Knowledge born from necessity and observation rather than ancient texts and theory, Sarah began training other survivors in these techniques, not as formal students, but as practical apprentices learning skills that kept people alive. She was helping to create a new kind of medicine, less concerned with philosophical theories about bodily humors, more focused on what actually worked. When the formal church hierarchy tried to rebuild itself, they discovered they were rebuilding in a world that no longer automatically deferred to their authority. The survivors had learned to think for themselves, to question what they'd been told, to trust their own observations over received wisdom. I watched Cardinal Thomas arrive in Winchester to reassert papal authority over a diocese that had been managing itself for 2 years. He expected the usual ceremonies, the ritual submission, the careful protocols that had governed church relations for centuries. Instead, he found a community that had developed its own leadership, its own methods, its own interpretations of Christian doctrine. They were still Christians, but they were Christians who'd learned that God's work could be done without the cardinal's permission. The cardinal tried to reassert control through familiar methods, threats of excommunication, appeals to ancient authority, elaborate ceremonies designed to overwhelm and intimidate. But these people had survived the apocalypse. They weren't easily impressed by ceremonial power anymore. By winter 1351, the active plague was mostly spent in Western Europe, though it would return in smaller waves for generations. But Europe was permanently changed, not just by who had died, but by how the survivors had adapted to their deaths. The labor shortage had made workers valuable. The breakdown of authority had made people self-reliant. The crisis of faith had made spirituality more personal. The collapse of old hierarchies had created space for new kinds of achievement and social mobility. Most importantly, the plague had taught Europeans that the world could end and they could survive it. That everything they'd been told was permanent and sacred was actually temporary and negotiable. When pushed to the edge of extinction, humans don't just survive. They innovate, they adapt, they become something new. The children born after the plague would grow up in this transformed world. They would inherit its new freedoms and its new responsibilities. They would take for granted things their grandparents had never imagined possible: social mobility, personal choice in marriage, the right to question authority, the value of practical knowledge over ancient wisdom. These children would become the generation that built the Renaissance, that funded exploration, that challenged every assumption about how society should work. Not because they were smarter or braver than their ancestors, but because they were born into a world that the plague had already torn apart and rebuilt. The Black Death had been Europe's destroyer and creator, its nightmare and awakening. It had killed the medieval world so completely that something unprecedented could grow in its place. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take generations to fully unfold. But the direction was set. Europe was learning to think of itself differently. not as a collection of unchanging hierarchies ordained by God, but as a place where anyone who survived could write their own story, claim their own future, build their own version of what human society could become. The plague had ended. The revolution it started was just beginning. By 1360, I was walking through a Europe that would have been unrecognizable to anyone from before the plague. The physical scars were healing, new houses replacing burned ones, new churches rising where old ones had crumbled, new faces in familiar places. But the deeper changes were just beginning to reveal themselves. In England, I witnessed something that would have seemed impossible in 1347. Peasants refusing to work for their traditional lords and successfully demanding better terms. The peasants' revolt was still decades away, but its seeds were already sprouting in countless small negotiations between survivors who suddenly had choices they'd never possessed before. I watched William Carter, a farmer from Kent, walk away from Lord Hastings' estate when offered the same terms his father had accepted for generations. Carter had options now. 3 other lords within a day's walk were competing for his labor, offering higher wages, better conditions, more freedom. My father worked for bread and shelter, Carter told me. But I've seen how quickly bread and shelter can disappear. Now I work for coins. Coins I can carry if I need to run. Lord Hastings was furious but helpless. He could threaten Carter with legal action, but what court would hear the case when half the judges were dead and the other half were dealing with their own labor shortages? He could try to use force, but Carter was young and strong while Hastings was old and had no men at arms to enforce his will. So Hastings negotiated. Grudgingly, angrily, but he negotiated. Because empty fields produce nothing, and nothing is worse than reduced profits. This scene repeated across Europe. The plague had created a labor market where workers held power they'd never imagined possible. Not just to demand higher wages, but to choose their work, their homes, their lives. In Florence, I saw Jacopo di Banco transform from a cloth dyer's apprentice to one of the city's most successful merchants. Before the plague, guild restrictions would have kept him as an apprentice for decades, then limited him to minor roles for life. But with half the guild dead and desperate demand for quality cloth, Jacopo simply started his own workshop. When the surviving guild masters tried to shut him down, Jacopo made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He'd join their guild and pay the traditional fees, but as a master, not an apprentice. He had the skills, the customers, and the capital. They had the choice of accepting him as an equal or watching him create a competing organization. They chose acceptance. The alternative was irrelevance. The church faced similar reckonings. In parish after parish, I watched communities that had learned to function without priestly authority struggle with returning clerical oversight. Many had developed their own liturgies, their own interpretations of doctrine, their own relationships with the divine that didn't require intermediaries. Father John arrived in the village of Little Wickham in 1352 to reassert ecclesiastical control over a community that had been managing its own spiritual affairs for 3 years. He found a congregation that had modified traditional prayers, created new rituals for their particular losses, and developed a theology that emphasized God's presence in survival rather than submission. These practices are irregular. Father John announced on his first Sunday, "We must return to proper observance." The congregation listened politely, then continued doing exactly what they'd been doing. They'd learned that God answered prayers regardless of who spoke the Latin, that comfort could come from anyone willing to provide it, that faith was about what you did more than what authority you obeyed. Father John adapted, or he would have preached to empty pews. The survivors had developed immunity to irrelevant authority along with their immunity to plague. But the most profound changes were happening in how people thought about time and planning. Before the plague, Europeans had assumed continuity, that their children would live similar lives to their own, that social structures would persist, that the future was essentially predictable. The plague had taught them that everything could change overnight. This created a new attitude toward both risk and opportunity. People became more willing to try new things because they'd learned that safety was an illusion anyway. Better to fail at something interesting than succeed at something meaningless. I met Isabella de Montefeltro, a noblewoman who'd lost her entire family but inherited vast holdings across 3 different regions. Before the plague, Isabella's future had been predetermined. Marriage to another noble, children, managing a household, dying in the same castle where she'd been born. Instead, she decided to travel, not as a pilgrim or an exile, but as an explorer of possibilities. She used her inheritance to fund trading expeditions to the east, to commission new forms of art, to establish schools where both boys and girls could learn to read. "I've seen how quickly everything disappears," she told me. "So I want to see what new things can be created." Isabella wasn't alone. Across Europe, survivors were using their inherited wealth and freedom to experiment with ideas that would have been impossible in the rigid pre-plague world. The Renaissance, still decades away from its full flowering, was being seeded in these moments of individual choice and creative risk-taking. The universities were rebuilding too, but differently. The old curriculum had emphasized memorizing ancient authorities and debating abstract theological questions. The new students wanted practical knowledge, mathematics that helped with trade, natural philosophy that explained disease, rhetoric that worked in negotiations with equals rather than submission to superiors. I attended lectures at the University of Paris in 1358, watching Master Jean de Buridan teach natural philosophy to students who interrupted with questions. Their predecessors never would have dared ask. "But Master," said one young man, "if Aristotle says heavy objects fall faster than light ones, why do stones and feathers hit the ground at the same time when dropped from the cathedral tower?" In the old world, such a question would have been heretical. Challenging ancient authority was forbidden. But these students had grown up watching authority die of disease like everyone else. They'd learned to test ideas against reality rather than accepting them because someone important had written them down centuries ago. Master Jean paused, considering. In the pre-plague world, he would have explained why the students' observations must be wrong, why Aristotle couldn't be mistaken. But he was teaching survivors now, people who trusted their own eyes more than ancient texts. "Let's test it again," he said finally. "And let's measure carefully this time." That willingness to test, to question, to trust observation over authority would eventually produce the scientific revolution. But it started here, in classrooms full of plague survivors who'd learned that just because something was old didn't mean it was true. The demographic changes created opportunities for groups that had been marginalized before the plague. With traditional power structures weakened and labor shortages critical, there was suddenly room for talents that had been ignored or suppressed. Women found themselves running businesses, managing estates, making decisions that had previously been reserved for men. Not because attitudes about women had fundamentally changed, but because necessity trumped ideology. Dead husbands and fathers left behind work that needed doing, and their widows and daughters were often the only ones available to do it. I watched Margaret Kemp transform from a brewer's wife to one of Norwich's most successful merchants. She'd always had a head for numbers and negotiation, but before the plague, those skills had been channeled into managing her husband's business. From the shadows, with her husband dead and no male relatives to inherit, Margaret stepped into full control. She discovered she was not just competent but brilliant at it, better at reading markets, more skilled at managing workers, more creative at finding solutions to problems. When other merchants tried to exclude her from their guild, Margaret threatened to take her business elsewhere. The city couldn't afford to lose one of its most successful enterprises for the sake of traditional gender roles. She was admitted to the guild as a full member, setting precedent that other women would follow. The same thing was happening with younger sons who'd never expected to inherit anything. The plague had wiped out so many firstborn heirs that entire Bloodlines were being continued by men who'd planned to join the church or seek their fortunes as mercenaries. I knew Robert de Clare, a third son who'd been destined for a monastery before the plague killed his two older brothers and his father. Instead of becoming a monk, Robert inherited lands, titles, and responsibilities he'd never been trained for. But Robert brought something to lordship that traditional heirs often lacked: humility and creativity. He'd grown up expecting to serve, rather than rule, so when he found himself with power, he used it differently. He listened to his tenants, experimented with new farming methods, treated his role as a job to be done well rather than a privilege to be enjoyed. His lands prospered while traditional lords struggled to maintain their authority over increasingly independent-minded peasants. Robert's success created a new model of leadership, based on competence and cooperation rather than birthright and coercion. These individual transformations were adding up to something larger, a complete reimagining of what European society could look like. The plague had accidentally performed an experiment in radical social restructuring, and the results were surprisingly positive for those who survived. Cities that had been devastated were rebuilding themselves as more efficient, more sanitary, more beautiful versions of what they'd been before. The survivors had learned hard lessons about urban planning from watching disease spread through crowded, filthy medieval streets. I helped with the rebuilding of Siena, where the survivors decided to design their new city with the plague in mind. Wider streets to reduce crowding, better sewage systems to prevent contamination, more public fountains to ensure clean water access, housing regulations that prevented the kind of overcrowding that had turned neighborhoods into death traps. The result was a city that was not just more resistant to disease, but more pleasant to live in. Cleaner air, safer water, more light and space. The plague's lessons about public health were being written into stone and mortar, but perhaps the most important change was psychological. The plague survivors had learned that they could endure unimaginable loss and still choose to keep living, keep building, keep hoping. This knowledge gave them a kind of fearlessness about other changes. If you can survive the death of everything familiar, what's scary about challenging unjust laws? If you can rebuild civilization from scratch, what's intimidating about starting a new business or learning a new skill or questioning an old assumption? The plague had been a teacher, and its lesson was simple. You are stronger than you know. The world is more changeable than you've been told, and endings are also beginnings. I saw this fearlessness everywhere. In the art that dared to show real human emotion. In the merchants who challenged guild restrictions. In the scholars who questioned ancient authorities. In the peasants who demanded dignity along with their wages. In the women who claimed space. In occupations that had been male-only for centuries. Europe in 1360 was still recognizably European, still Christian, still hierarchical, still divided into kingdoms and duchies and city-states. But underneath those familiar forms, something revolutionary was stirring. The plague had planted seeds of change that would take centuries to fully grow, but their first green shoots were already visible to anyone who knew how to look. The survivors had inherited more than property and wealth. They'd inherited possibility, the knowledge that the world could be different than it had always been, that individuals could shape their own destinies, that suffering could be transformed into strength rather than just endured as divine will. Black Death had killed the medieval world, but from its grave, something unprecedented was rising. The modern world, with all its promise and peril, its freedoms and responsibilities, its capacity for both creation and destruction, the great dying was over. The great building had begun. I'm the historian. I have seen much, and I will see more. Perhaps, one day, I shall tell you again about other endings that became beginnings, other destructions that cleared space for creation. The Black Death taught Europe that everything familiar can disappear overnight, but also that humans are capable of building something beautiful from the worst kinds of rubble. It revealed that social structures are more fragile than we want to believe, but human resilience is stronger than we dare to hope. In the end, the plague didn't just change Europe, it taught Europe how to change itself. The survivors learned that when the old world dies, the living get to decide what the new world looks like. That lesson echoes still in every moment when ordinary people choose to build rather than simply endure, to hope rather than simply survive. The great dying became the great teaching. And what it taught was this: you are more than what you inherit. You are what you choose to create from what remains. Until we meet again in the spaces between what was and what might yet be.